Zippers are super important to gear, so we'll quickly review a standard zipper to get the terminology right before discussing common problems and solutions. So on each side you have this track, and this track is what we'll be combining together. On one side you have a metal insertion pin, and on the other you have this box. This is a starter box. So you slide the metal insertion pin through the slider body until the very end of the starter box. And then you pull on this pull tab. And when you do that, the slider, as it moves, it forces the two sides of a track together. And at the very end, you have your end stops, these two metal crimps that prevent the slider from pulling off the track entirely. And this is how a standard zipper operates. Now, this is a single-sided pull, so I'm only operating it on this one side, because on the other side, there isn't really anything to pull on. There are two-sided pulls very commonly used in gear. Look at this tent. You obviously have a pull on one side. But then if you flip it over, you'll also notice that there is yet another pull on the other side. And this makes sense because we want to be able to zip and unzip a tent easily from inside or from outside. With a sleeping bag, in this case, you have a single pull that works on both sides thanks to this U-channel. Speaking of sleeping bags, sometimes you don't have a starter box. Instead, you have a second zipper that functions as the end. So in this case, what you do is you line up the two zippers together so that this channel lines up. And this channel is what you're going to be sliding the metal insertion pin into. With a standard zipper, this is really easy. You just slide until you reach the end of the stopper box. Here, you don't have a fixed stopper box, you have another zipper slider, so paying attention to alignment is really key. So notice what happens in bad alignment. The top track ends about halfway up the end zipper, whereas the second track on the bottom ends a little bit after that. You'll see it better later. If you zip this up, okay, sure, it's working. And here's where you can really see it, right? Like the two ends of the metal pins aren't aligned. So while this works, if this were disturbed, you can see it might actually just unzip because it wasn't tightly linked together at the very end. So now you get to this first problem, the orphan slider problem. To be clear, this slider can continue zipping up. See, I can continue to zip it up in the right direction. But again, it just unzips itself. To fix this, you just need to get the orphan slider back so that you can reset and restart the process. Sometimes the zipper slider can get quite stuck. Just try using the zipper pull and not yanking the track, which can damage the teeth, which is a much harder problem to solve, as we'll talk about in a moment. Practice makes perfect in terms of learning the right amount of force to use. Many people have experience with this problem. Your zipper is just stuck, and nothing seems out of the ordinary. You just simply can't pull on it really anymore. So if nothing looks stuck on the outside, then go ahead and flip it over. And you might see something like this. The fabric is caught up in the slider and is preventing the slider from moving along the track. Sometimes people will try to just pull on the zipper pull as hard as they can to free this up, and that does work. But in the process, you can damage the fabric. It's better to apply lateral force to get the fabric out. And again, practice makes perfect here, but you're just trying to kind of yank the fabric. The problem is so common that you might see what looks like this. This is a zipper slider with a big plastic box around it, the whole purpose of which is to stop fabric from getting trapped.
The most problematic issue is this one. You're zipping, and then you notice that, oh, it didn't really quite zip. See, it's just open. And by the way, sometimes it doesn't open so naturally, which is why we do the test where we tug on it to make sure it did close. This one, you can completely just pry apart. And obviously, that's not going to work very well. This problem is complicated because there are two potential sub-reasons for why this is happening.
It's rare but easy to check for. You might have a broken slider. For example, take a look at this slider right here. If you notice, the area in red just looks a little bit jagged and messed up. If you look in the subsequent pictures, try to see that jagged edge. It's kind of curling up and it just doesn't look that great. This is very rare, but if it happens, then this slider should actually be removed and replaced, and we'll talk about that later, because otherwise keeping it on can continue to damage the zipper track even more because the ripped edges are wearing against the track. A busted slider like this isn't very common. More common is that you might have a slider that just gets worn out over time.
So how a slider works is that the two separate ends of the track go in on the wider side, and then they come out the taper side, the smaller side. So what happens is that as you go through the tapered body, the tracks get zipped together. Now over time, as you use a zipper slider and pull it back and forth, the metal wears away and then it begins to open up, kind of in all directions and not entirely in predictable ways. So the first thing that we're going to do whenever we see this happening is try to see if we can fix this worn zipper by crimping it down. So you're going to do this with a needle nose plier. Basically crimp everywhere. Bottom right, and then here you're going to do bottom left. And then after that, you're going to do top right, and then you're going to do top left. And then you're going to look at it in this way and then crimp the narrower side, the more taper side, and then also crimp the wider side or the larger side. Now, to do that, you have to first get the zipper pull down to where it wasn't separating, which, as we've seen from moving the whole orphan slider problem, it can be a little bit challenging. So notice that what I did here is I pulled on the tab the whole time. All right, so now I'm going to try to show you. And top, bottom doesn't really matter. Just notice I'm crimping on, top right here, and then top left. To get the other side, in this case, I'm going to unzip the other side so that I have the space to maneuver and kind of get in and tackle at that first zipper on the right. So once again, I'm going to do this left side crimp and then do the right side crimp. And now, remember, you want to also crimp in the other direction. So now I'm crimping the tapered side and I'm crimping the wider side. But unlike with the freestanding zipper, I'm not getting the back side really. So now I'm going to flip this over so that I can crimp once again the narrow side and then the wide side. And when you crimp, you're going to apply quite a bit of pressure, and this can only be done with a metal zipper slider. So now let's go ahead and just try pulling it and see what happens. We're going to zoom out a little bit so we have a little bit of space. And then we're going to just pull it and hope it works. Alas, we still see that part where it's separating. That did not quite work out. So now we have to try to see if it's another problem.
More rarely, you'll have an issue with the actual tooth or teeth. So take a look at the one that I'm pointing at in the middle of this section. It looks just a little bit out of line. So one idea is to take a dental-esque tool, and I'm kind of just working the nylon coil tooth, kind of back and forth, and sometimes I'll use a pair of pliers as well, and just be a little gentle. Whatever I can do to see, now it looks a little bit more kind of back in line with all of the other teeth. And that's what you'll just try to get to. Now, I'm going to try to zip this up and see how it works. And now, if I check, I notice that unfortunately, right where that tooth was kind of busted, the track looks different. It's a little bit overlapping on one side, even though it's closed.
But it does look like from the earlier picture that I was able to fix the tooth. So now we need to go back to our first hypothesis, the worn slider problem. because both the track, the teeth, and the slider are all old. A good slider should be able to deal with a tooth that's a little bit not perfect and that we had tried to fix. Because as we'll talk about later, a worn out tooth is much harder to deal with. So to test that, we're going to go ahead and try to pull through this area with the good zipper and see what happens. So when we pull with the good zipper, we notice that, wow, it pulled very smoothly. And if you look super closely at it, the teeth are in very good position. They're locked one over the other. If we had been unable to fix the tooth, such as in this situation, where you can see the tooth, there's nothing to be fixed, it's gone, we would have to send it out for professional repair. And in that case, they wouldn't just be able to replace a single tooth, they would need to replace the entire track. That's why we want to try all other hypotheses before resorting to that solution. Let's recap what we've done so far. While pulling one slider, we noticed an issue with the track opening caused by a malformed tooth that we then fixed. But even though we fixed it, the slider where we noticed the issue is still having a problem closing up the track. So at this point, I've crimped this slider offline and it hasn't really fixed the problem. Because again, even though the tooth is fixed, it's kind of a worn out slider, unlike this one right here. So now we're just going to go ahead and try replacing the slider entirely. When replacing the slider, we have to be sure to replace it with the same type of slider, and that's the most important part. Again, this is a tent. People want to be able to zip open and close from either side, so it is a double-sided zipper slider, and we need to find another double-sided zipper slider. The other consideration is that not all zipper sliders and zipper tracks are the same size. The size, which is the number of zipper, is measured by the width of the narrow tapered end. So a number 5 zipper, which this is, means that it's 5 millimeters. Rather than measuring, I find it to be a lot easier to take a replacement zipper, line it up with the old one, and really eyeball it to make sure that it is the right size. Once you've found the right size zipper slider, technically you can stop working on this and just bring it to a tailor. Because whether the tailor replaces the slider or you do, we have to take it offsite anyway so they can sew back the opening that we're going to need. But for training's sake, let's say we're the ones doing it ourselves. So first we got to take off this slider. Now we could pull it off of either direction, but going the other way, we'll have to go past the good slider. So let's not, and let's take it off the other end where there's nothing but track. So let's go ahead and pull it toward the very start of the track. We talked about how with a tent, the track isn't designed to separate. The end is sewn shut. So you're going to take this seam ripper tool and basically open up the seam here. So this is a little bit of a process and it depends exactly on the tent because all the zippers and the seams and the tents are constructed a little bit differently. But you're going to open up as many seams as you need to get the zipper slider out. What you'll often notice is that the track is tucked into a channel of fabric, even underneath this top piece of beige fabric that you see here. So again, there's no right answer. You're just going to keep going until you're able to remove all the fabric covering up the track so that you can see the track looking something like this. So here we see the track with nothing covering it, and perhaps no surprise, if you pull on the zipper slider, it'll just fall right off of the track. And now we are ready to go ahead and put on the new slider. This process, again, takes some patience and takes some number of tries. Remember the orientation of the slider, so which side needs to go in first. It's the same as with the old slider. So you're going to slide one end up and then do the other end. The most important thing here is, again, remembering alignment and how critical that is. So you're going to get it in just a little bit so that you can double check your alignment as soon as possible. I'm going to show you what it looks like after I've gotten the slider in a little bit to check the alignment. Take a look at this. My alignment is off. The top track has two teeth that are out. So I'm going to show you what happens if we were to use this as is. So I'm going to go ahead and push on the slider to get it a little bit more up the track so that I can begin pulling it. And again, it's a little bit of a process. And once I start to pull it, trust me, it feels different. It feels very odd, very sticky. And in fact, I'm not going to get very far before I run into a little bit of a snag. Look, the zipper track is already a little bit misaligned and it felt really bad. Next try. So take a look at this alignment. That looks great. From the get-go, all of the teeth are zipped together and there are no extra teeth just lying around. Really, that extra tooth can make all the difference. So let's try it again with this one. Again, the double-sided zippers are a little bit harder to work with. I push on one of the tabs so that I can start getting this a little bit more in before I can start pulling. And once I'm able to start pulling, again, the feeling is going to tell you a lot. This feels extremely smooth, extremely easy, and I'm going to continue going, see if it snags anywhere at all, and you'll see I'm going past the problem area with no issue, none whatsoever. The teeth look very clean, very close up, and it didn't feel like it was catching in the slightest. So that's great. By replacing a zipper and fixing the old tooth, we've addressed this problem completely. So to be considered functional, a zipper track just needs one slider. So if we could not replace the slider for some reason, keeping the other one working would have been fine. But in this case, it's always good that we are able to restore the tent back to the same condition it used to be.
Okay, but what if you install a new slider and it just doesn't work? So here, let's say I have this slider and this is brand new and I'm putting it on this track and I'm starting to work it down. And once I do, hey, the part behind just didn't zip up and nothing is zipping up. And now I kind of have this orphan slider that I'm just moving around. This really depends. In my case, what I'm feeling is that the slider just doesn't feel very attached. It feels like it's not sufficiently gripping the two sides of the track and it's not closing them up. You can kind of tell because I could literally just, you see what I did there? I just gripped one side of the track and I moved it back and forth so I can move this track out of alignment on either side super easily. Now, in this case, you just want to pop the slider off firstly and unfortunately try to repeat the process again because maybe it wasn't well aligned the first time, which is always a possibility. And maybe the second time you do it, it'll be better. These things can take many tries. If it still doesn't work, however, you can try to put it in the other way. So in other words, if this way doesn't work, you can take the other end of the track, open this track, and then pop the slider on this way. When you do that, and it comes toward the other end that was already open, it'll come out the opposite way. Sometimes this actually will address the problem. So let's try it in this case. We've opened up the other end and we've put on that slider. We're going through the process of getting it on. It's on a little bit. And you can see already it's on a little bit and it's on and the back part is zipped. So this is great. It's going to stay continued zipped, and that's perfect. So we're going to just spend some time to pull the slider all the way up. Remember, checking the whole track. Now, once we get back to the original part that we had opened, this slider is going in the other direction entirely. So remember, the first slider we put in like that, it didn't work. We opened the other end and we put it in like this, and it does seem to be holding the track together much better. So in this case, we just want to be sure that we tape up both ends for the tailor to sew up, but this is one way that we have managed to fix the zipper and not have to repair the entire track. That brings to mind slider pull direction. In all the examples we've seen, the slider goes on wide side first. But what if you're replacing a pull that looked like this? Can you put on a slider narrow side first? Well, the answer is technically you can, but it's actually very, very difficult. It's so difficult, in fact, that I actually think it would be easier to just open up the other end of the zipper track and slide this slider on wide side first so that it ends up emerging back on this end wide side first. But what if you had a situation like this? There is an inherent conflict here. Just take a second to study the image. If you're not putting the sliders on narrow side first, then there's no way that you can open up both sides and slide them both on wide side first and get them in this resulting orientation because it just conflicts. The green slider would have to go on in the direction of the blue arrow, and the blue slider would have to go on in the direction of the green arrow. That's just not possible. When you have this kind of conflict, this is where a little bit of strategy comes in. You kind of have to decide which slider is more important, because most likely you're only going to replace that one and just take the other one off completely. For this reason, it can be helpful to know where you might find this type of slider. And the truth is, this might have all sounded very crazy, but all Rainfly sliders are like this in this weird orientation. This is the Rainfly that exact image was taken from, and the track has been taped back with gaffer tape. So one of the zippers is going up this direction. The other one at the bottom at the flap is going up the opposite direction because the flap needs to stay open at the very bottom. The reason being that the flap being open at the very bottom is how people get in and out of the Rainfly door. Take a second to imagine if the very bottom flap didn't open fully and instead were sewn shut. I mean, you could still get in and out of the hole, but there'd be a tripping hazard, wouldn't there? This may seem a little unfair because it requires some knowledge of zippers and Rainflies and how it all works. But it really doesn't because it's kind of intuitive. So let's go back to this image. Let's say that you had no idea why it was so important that these sliders go on in this orientation, and you were like, okay, I'm just going to put them on in the orientation that makes most sense. In other words, imagine the orientation of the blue and the green sliders flipped to match the arrows. So let's take this simple image as an example. You're going to put on this zipper on the bottom end going up wide side first, effectively flipping the orientation. So then this is just like a jacket. A jacket zipper pull is in the orientation such that as you pull up, you zip it closed. But notice this jacket zipper has something at the very bottom. That's the zipper box, and that box is what keeps the two sides from sliding themselves open as you apply any kind of pressure. With the Rainfly, going back to the simple image, there isn't a box there. So if you were to slide this zipper pull up in this direction, sure, as you pulled up, you would zip, but the bottom would just pull open and unzip everything. There's no box. And so hopefully looking at this, your intuition kicks in and you think, okay, they wouldn't have designed this without a box to hold it closed unless it didn't need a box because the direction is different. And if you can draw that logical conclusion, then you don't need to have known anything about why the zippers were flipped and what a Rainfly is in order to successfully fix this item. Also using logic, if you know therefore that the zipper slider has to emerge in this direction, then if you can only put one on due to a conflict, then of those two zipper sliders in this image, you would only keep the green slider and take out the blue one entirely. All of this somewhat complicated situation is because it is so difficult to put the zipper sliders on the track backward. If you are able to get the sliders on in this orientation backward from the narrow side first, then you have a superpower, and you should absolutely do it that way and ignore pretty much the last 5 minutes of this video. Okay, but sometimes track issues are unavoidable. So you could have just completely busted, broken, or missing teeth. Or you might have a situation that looks like this. So this is a new slider that I've put on this track. And I've already put it in both directions, yet it is still splitting right there. And I've gone back and forth a couple of times on this. I don't really know why it's splitting right there. If I unzip it entirely and look at the teeth, I see nothing wrong. Sometimes the track is just depreciated to a point where nothing is super visible, but it just isn't going to work anymore. Of course, replacing the entire zipper track is the ideal solution. But the truth is, this is almost never really done, either by us as a business or by individuals for their own gear, just because the cost of replacing an entire zipper track for almost any gear item usually ends up being at least $100. That's why if you're at the point where you've tried all possible solutions and you think that replacing the entirety of the track is the only way, the next step would be checking with your manager and see if you can come up with some creative solutions that allow this item to still be usable without replacing the entirety of the track. So for example, let's take this tent. This tent, and I'm going to point it out right now, actually has a sewn-in stopper where two teeth are broken. So in other words, the stopper is in the middle of the track. One zipper can zip back and no further forward, and then the other zipper can obviously zip a much longer way backward, but also no further forward. This stopper has been sewn directly into the track and doesn't really affect the functionality. It just means that to close this door, a person would have to keep the zippers at this stopper point. This is a great example of a creative solution to a zipper track issue that doesn't necessitate the repair of the entire track. Of course, if you look at how this is sewed, if we were ever to need to replace the entire track, we still could, because this is only sewed directly on the zipper tooth and the very edges of the track.
That was a lot. Let's finish on something easy. So take a look at this zipper slider. It's a double-sided pull, and it's easier for you to see that on one side, we clearly have the cord that makes up the pull, but on the other side, it's missing. So we have tons of cord. It's very easy to tie it in. But before you do that, pay really close attention and notice, do you see that metal arch that forms the part where the pull attaches to doesn't actually connect down to both ends of the slider. There's just a little bit of a gap right there where I'm pointing. And sure, in this case, the gap is small enough to be facetious, but sometimes this gap is quite big for design purposes. So whatever material that you choose to go ahead and tie off to make the new pull, you want to make sure that material is either too big to slide through this gap, or you want to tie it directly to the piece of metal as opposed to just looping it around, where it could actually slide off, and believe it or not, that has happened before. Sometimes you'll have a zipper slider that looks like this. This one's much easier to deal with because clearly the metal arch connects both sides to the slider body, and then any loop will do to make a pull.